Welcome to the episode. I'm Dr. Armin Feldman, and as always, I'm here with my friend, colleague, and partner in Physicians Legal Consultants, Dr. Mike Bummer.
Hi, Armin, and hello to our listeners. It's great to be back. We had a busy few weeks here. I know the holidays passed, and we've been very excitedly busy with work. We've had a lot of various cases and matters come through, so we've kind of had to delay this episode a little bit, but here we are back again, and it's amidst this time. I wanted to mention to you, Armin, we didn't talk about this yet, but there was a documentary on Netflix that was released within the last 10 days called
Mhm.
You Are What You Eat. And I can't remember from previous episodes if I've talked about being, plant-based and incorporating more plants into our diet for my family. But
Mhm.
this documentary is very interesting. There's actually um, not it's not just like a watch it because you believe in it thing, but they did a twin study, identical twins,
Oh,
and they
yeah.
fed them. Did you hear about this?
I just saw it. It's funny, Mike. I just saw it today on the internet. But go ahead.
They followed identical twins and they gave one twin a healthy standard omnivore diet. Like, I've been saying chicken Alfredo and, various healthy versions of what we would go out to a restaurant and order. And then
Yeah.
they gave the other twin a vegan diet. Not even all whole food, plant based, and things that people think taste like cardboard and whatnot, but just
Right.
avoiding animal products like dairy and meats. And really interesting. They did a great job with it. The people going through it were pretty skeptical on both ends, and they're very real people. And the study, I think the results were pretty surprising, and they weren't, again, it wasn't like this big push of an agenda. So I'd recommend you and any of our listeners just check it out. It's 4 mini parts, so it's only like 45 minutes per episode, and it's really well done.
Mention the name again.
It's called You Are What You Eat.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right.
What about you? Tell us something that besides work that you did in the last week or so.
Right. Well, we've been so busy. All we've really had a chance to talk about since the holidays is work. So we really haven't had much of a chance to catch up. But funny thing is, I was going to tell you something food related as well. Now, this isn't exactly a big deal, but we're really good friends with our neighbors across the street. And they took us to a restaurant that is close to where we live. And it turns out that the food was fantastic. The prices were right, and the way things have been since the pandemic, restaurants are so hit and miss, right? So the food may not be good, the prices are high, and I was excited. Holly and I were excited to find a restaurant so close to the house with such great food, such reasonable prices, and where our neighbors might call us on a weekday and say, "Hey, let's run over there and have dinner." And so it's a small thing, but it was really exciting,
Why
and
did you not try it before?
didn't know about it. Yeah, just didn't know it
Huh.
existed. Yeah,
What type of cuisine is it?
it's called the Parkway Grill, and one of the interesting things about it is the menu is about as long as War and Peace,
Oh,
right? So it's got a little bit of everything,
okay.
and anything I've tried has been great. So not a big deal. But one other thing I would say is one interesting thing is we didn't know this. We gravitated towards one another, but we both follow plant-based diets.
I know. Isn't it funny
Yeah,
that we don't even talk about that at all?
yeah, right. So I
Contrary
think
to the jokes on the internet that you find out if someone's vegan within the first 30 seconds you meet them. That's just not my style, but
right, right. Well, Holly and I have been doing this for over 20 years now.
oh, it's great. Cool.
Yeah. So I think we have a really great show today. Mike, you've got a really interesting case. And then when we discuss today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about depression that's caused by trauma. It's such an important issue. We haven't talked about it, and I think it'll be helpful for our attorney listeners, our physician listeners, and anyone that's really listening.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, my case is from a few months ago, and I have various number. We have attorneys that use us somewhat frequently because of our consultation abilities. And I should just mention before I start, if anyone listening at any point has a case that they want to discuss with us, one of the easiest ways is to send us a message to comments@physicianshelpingattorneys.com, or look below in the show notes. There's a link to schedule a meeting. You can visit our website. And but again, send us an email, give us a call. We're happy to talk about anything. But
yeah, we really love to talk with you.
I don't even know if you remember this, Armin, from a while back, but we have a client that reached out who had a case kind of that was pretty well along. And this is a malpractice case. And the case involved a woman who had a gallbladder removal. They call it a laparoscopic cholecystectomy.
Yeah.
And during the case, the surgeon went in and saw that she had a lot of adhesions or scar tissue around the area of the gallbladder. And this surgeon was particularly well trained and felt comfortable at the time. And the note dictated was pretty elaborate that these adhesions existed, and the bowel was kind of nearby, and there were other organs nearby. And he went ahead and proceeded with the surgery and commented on having to take adhesions down from the bowel and whatnot, and completed the surgery. It took quite some time. And in follow-up, the woman did pretty well, but she developed some foul-smelling discharge and also started having some foul-smelling urine. And this happened over the following months. And the surgeon wasn't really sure what to do, so he sent her to a urologist. He continued to follow her and reassure her. And long story short, about 8 months later, it was found that she had developed a fistula, which is a tract connecting a portion of her bowels to her bladder.
Wow.
And that's obviously very serious. And so she actually did have stool coming out in her urine.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it had not been detected appropriately, potentially, and at least right away. And she ultimately had to have part of her bowels removed and additional surgery. And so this case, though, had already kind of materialized quite a bit before it got to me. And our attorney, said, I had a standard of care report from a doc that said, that a general surgeon, that said that this cholecystectomy should not have been done. And I ran into a problem, though, because we're due for, proceeding with the case, and we hit a milestone, and he disappeared on me. He said that he can't support the case anymore.
So what did he ask you to do?
He asked me to find another expert. And
okay.
So when we find experts, for all of our listeners, it's important to know that we don't just forward you a name. We don't just send you someone that we've worked with who is a name that, we don't just look at some database and just say, oh, here, call this guy. We actually look into the case, try to understand the salient elements of it, and then find an expert that aligns the credentials, the training, and even to somewhat, taking the temperature of an opinion and having a brief discussion with that expert on your behalf as your consultant, as someone who's, providing this affordable but very valuable service to our attorney clients.
Yeah, it's really being a consultant and not just turfing off a name to someone.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so in doing this, though, the reason this was interesting and I thought it would be good to talk about today is I wasn't so sure that this ultimately was going to be a fruitful case, because when I looked at the preoperative discussion, when I looked at the surgeon's notes, when I looked at the op report, I think I understood why his initial expert, who gave him the affidavit of merit, the initial signature
Hmm.
on the 3 or 4 sentence report that allowed him to file the case. I was able to tease out that I think that surgeon bailed because he was a bit too aggressive at the time, and he was probably worried about getting, you know, put on the stand, deposed, and really having to answer the tough questions about the fact that this surgeon was qualified to,
Hmm.
in fact, do the surgery. This micro bowel perforation, tiny hole that was probably, I think the causation of the case was actually quite clear. I do think it was a surgical complication, that a damage to the bowel that resulted in this fistula formation.
Yeah, one
But
thing, Mike, that I just wanted to emphasize is this was a micro puncture. So does that mean that it probably wasn't even visible to the surgeon?
yeah, there's almost no way this was going to be visible. The way these tissues exist, the surface of the bowel, it's a very thin layer, thin wall, and even if you just kind of, we'll say, uh, damage or reduce the strength of the bowel wall, sometimes even a hole can develop later. So maybe you
Mhm.
didn't even create a hole that day, but you undermined the strength of the bowel wall.
Yeah.
You then later could get a hole that appears, still
Hmm.
caused by the surgery. And
Sure.
ultimately, if the detection of this was worse, if there was breaches in standard of care or there was poor follow-up or poor testing, certainly causation is not a question here. But really, it came down to the crux of this case that the attorney had sent me and just asked for another expert. He said,
Yeah.
give me an
Right.
expert to support this case. I could have sent him 4 different surgical experts that we've worked with together, Armin. And these experts would have been happy to charge their, well, I shouldn't say
Sure.
happy, but they would have sent my attorney their retainer, their
Sure.
sizable retainer. They would have reviewed the case in probably 2 to 6 hours, and then they would have concluded almost exactly what I did, which was
Right.
that this was in fact a judgment call. My attorney asked me, well, couldn't the surgeon have decided to not do the procedure and then
Hmm.
the complication wouldn't have occurred? And I said, yes, absolutely, that could have been a possibility. But the surgeon was trained to work with adhesive disease in the bowel. And
Right.
the surgeon made a judgment call that day that it was reasonable to try to complete the task at hand after having discussed the risks, benefits, and alternatives of the surgical procedure. And ultimately, it's not that there's a 0% chance. Our attorneys and anyone in law
Sure.
know that these are not, we're not working in definitive black and white situations. So I didn't tell him it's definitely not pursuable or not
Right.
a breach, but I said I would be very cautious because of the defense strategy would be very strong, that this was a qualified judgment call, a known complication, albeit very, very catastrophic for this patient. And so, what I was happy about, and the reason I thought about it is I felt like
Mhm.
I saved this attorney, if not multiple retainer agreements with additional experts, and was able to kind of give a very affordable, quick, consultative opinion on the matter.
Yeah. I think that is well said, and I think what maybe the attorney would want to go forward anyway, but
Yeah,
I think you gave them the opportunity to save a tremendous amount of time, money, and certainly on a questionable outcome for the case.
I agree. I felt I could stand by that opinion.
Yeah.
Well,
What happened? What do you know? What happened?
no,
Did
I
the
don't. So I he didn't, like, Armin. Our attorneys don't always, we don't
Sure.
expect to be kept up to date.
Right.
I know he certainly did not ask me for that referral to one of our experts. Doesn't mean
Mm.
that he didn't pursue it separately.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, that's a really good case, and
Yeah.
I think it's kind of subtle in a way, but I think you really teased out. So you were going, the whole purpose was to find the expert, but really what you found is this may not be something you want to pursue.
Yep. And Armin, it only took a couple hours. I mean, it was
Yeah.
very affordable. the I'm pretty sure he wasn't so happy with the answer, but I'm pretty sure he was happy with the invoice.
He probably was happy with the answer.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
So let's jump topics. Let's talk about the kind of a less commonly understood damage in some of the cases that you've had experience with.
Yeah, great. Let's shift over. So, as I said, I want to talk just a little bit about depression that is related to trauma. And of course, as you know, Mike, certain psychiatric conditions are very, very common in trauma cases. In fact, depression and anxiety are extremely common problems after trauma. So, for today, I want to focus a little bit on depression. Now, depression is a common result of physical trauma and actually accidents in general. So, what's depression, right? I don't mean, I'm not going to get into the
Right.
biochemistry of it and all, but when somebody says they're depressed, what does that mean? Well, typically, depression is characterized by feeling low, feeling down and depressed, trouble sleeping, trouble eating, uh, loss of sex drive, having intrusive thoughts that they can't get out of their mind. Depression isn't all these things to all these people, but these are the symptoms that people get. Crying spells, difficulty concentrating, loss of attention span, also feelings of helplessness, feelings of hopelessness, uh, inability to get pleasure out of things, having low self esteem, loss of interest in life and social activities and relationships, complaints of feeling overwhelmed, getting fatigued, irritability, and of course, in some people, it's also going to include having suicidal thoughts. Now, particularly for our attorney and physician listeners, you can break depression down into two main categories. Now, what I'm going to talk about, this characterization has absolutely nothing to do with making proper psychiatric diagnoses according to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, where all the diagnoses are outlined and how you make the diagnosis. But this, I think, is very helpful for attorneys when thinking about and conceptualizing their client's depression after trauma. So, there is depression that is caused by biochemical changes in the brain, and there is depression that is situational. Now, of course, in the final analysis, all depression, right, is biochemical. Uh, Even Freud said that in writing in 1905. But you can break depression down into this one seems pretty biochemical, this one seems related to the person's life experience. So, for example, there is depression that's biochemical that's caused by having a concussion. There is also depression. Someone's in an auto accident, they have multiple injuries, their life is changed. So, for example, they can't work. So, due to stress, due to financial loss, maybe marital discord,
Mm-hmm.
this person experiences depression, which is situational based on those things, but it's all related to the trauma that they experienced. So the first distinction that you and I, as consulting doctors, and hopefully the treating doctors are doing, is that they should determine if they think the depression is biochemical, situational, or it could be both. Then you want to determine the severity of the depression in terms of how much the depression is interfering with the activities of daily living, including the client's ability to work, and also based on how many and how severe those symptoms are that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, this is something of an oversimplification, but um, if we think the depression is situational, in other words, the client's depressed because they can't work. Well, then maybe psychological treatment, psychotherapy, talking treatment may be all that's required. But if we think the depression is biochemical or the symptoms of the depression are very severe, then treatment by a psychiatrist, including probably taking medication, makes the most sense. Now, also, as we've discussed in our past episodes, it's not uncommon when we interview the client and we're meeting with them for the very first time, typically by Zoom or maybe in person, that we'll be the first doctor to make that diagnosis of depression. Uh, because the treating doctors, they're all just working on their part of the case. And they may not be focused in on, or the client may not talk about the fact that they're depressed. So let me give you a couple of examples. So let's start with a client that's rear-ended in an auto crash. And the client's car is hit with even a moderate amount of force, but it's enough force that the client sustains mild traumatic brain injury. And we determine that's due to whiplash, the violent shaking of the head back and forth, and also the actual physical hitting of their head against the headrest. So this is an actual case. And then the next day, the client started to notice symptoms of depression that I mentioned a few minutes ago that got progressively worse. Now, that is going to be a biochemical depression. What I mean by that is the client's life could be absolutely great. They love their life, they love their spouse, they have a great job, they have all kinds of relationships, there's no financial stress. But after this accident, all of a sudden, this person is feeling very depressed and maybe has some other symptoms of MTBI like memory loss and that kind of thing. So there are some very good papers that we can go to in the literature. And there's one paper, I actually want to quote it. So major depressive disorder was observed in 33% of the patients during the first year after an MTBI. And major depressive disorder was significantly more frequent among these patients than it was against a control group, people that hadn't been involved in that and had an TBI. And they go on to say in the article, major depression is a frequent complication of TBI that hinders the person's recovery. So that's yeah, go ahead.
Armin, does depression diagnosis actually does have a time frame attached with it for how long the symptoms have to be present? Am I correct on that?
Well, the symptoms can vary quite a bit. So,
but I just wondered if, because you had mentioned that these symptoms do show up oftentimes very early, but to actually get a physical or to get a diagnosis from the medical treating doc, and maybe I'm wrong, is there a 3-month or 6-month requirement of persistence of symptoms, or is that not relevant? I might be completely off.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's relevant.
Okay.
But you do bring up a really good point, and that is, and we've talked about this a lot. When people have traumatic injuries, what gets focused on first are the most immediate things: broken bones, ruptured discs, torn rotator cuffs. So even though the symptoms of the depression come on early, they're not reported in the medical records early. Right. And then as the case progresses and some of the treatment occurs for those more immediate things, then the symptoms of depression take center stage. And of course, we know that opposing doctors and opposing counsel are going to say, well, wait a second, this didn't turn up in the medical records until 3 months later. So it's not accident related. And we have to help our attorney explain why it is.
I have at least a dozen of those cases where the depression, like you mentioned, where depression was not initially on the attorney's list of impairments or functional losses, and in the interview teasing out that the client is severely impaired and requires additional treatment and diagnostic workup. So I wasn't going to interrupt you because you
No, good.
summarized that so well, but I wanted to point out that in our reports, for me, that's also very common.
Yeah, so I'm glad you actually said that. So I had three short cases I was going to talk about. Then I'm going to shorten this up so we don't go too long. But the other case that I was going to talk about that where it's biochemical depression, this was a workers' comp case, and this woman worked at a big box store. She was tasked to put these big planters on a metal rack and move them across to a different part of the store. Well, unbeknownst to her and probably the store, there was an area of the floor of the store that was uneven. In other words, it sloped down to the right. And she didn't notice this. She pushes the cart falls over, right? So one of these big planters hits her in the head, and then on the way down, the metal cart hits her in the head. And she winds up, she had a torn rotator cuff, fell on her shoulder. But she also had some memory loss, but her other main symptom was depression. Now, this is exactly what we talked about. What was worked on first? The rotator cuff injury, right? But her biggest problem from this accident really was a debilitating depression. And she got labeled as a malingerer, that she was just driven by secondary gain, that there were all kinds of accusations made, but it was clear to me, and then we passed her on to a psychiatrist for treatment and to the treating doctor, that this depression was directly related to being hit in the head twice, once by a really heavy planter and then smacked by a metal cart on the temporal side, on the side of her head. And that caused biochemical changes. By the way, what we think happens is that the actual nerve cells have a long part of the cell called the axon. And these axons get sheared and they get broken. And when that happens, there are biochemical changes in the brain, and these biochemical changes lead to depression. And that's what I put in my report.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Did you want to also share that third one before we wrap up?
I'll quickly share the third one.
Okay.
So this is a case of an older woman. She was driving in the mountains. She was rear-ended. Luckily, her car went into the mountainside and not off the cliffside, right? But she wound up with multiple injuries. She had to be flight for life to a hospital from where she crashed on I-70 in the mountains. And so she was dealing with multiple traumatic injuries. But when I talked to her on the phone, when I interviewed her, it was obvious, she hadn't mentioned it yet, but it was obvious to me that this woman was depressed. And actually, in the course of the conversation, she told me she was depressed. Mm-hmm. And what she was depressed about was the disruption to her life. Now her life was centered around going to doctors, getting treatment, going to physical therapy. She wasn't meeting with her friends anymore. And that's what made her depressed. So this wasn't a hit in the head kind of biochemical depression. This was a situational depression that was directly related to the trauma that she had. And actually, there's a diagnosis for this. It's called major depression secondary to a medical condition. Mm-hmm. In this case, the medical condition was multiple traumatic injuries that then disrupted her life so greatly that she developed pretty significant depression that had nothing to do with obvious biochemical changes.
Great cases, Armin. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about depression for hours, but I just thought that it would be helpful to our attorney clients and others to hear a little bit about that. It's another one of these. We had a podcast episode called Invisible Injuries, right? We talked about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This can be another one.
Absolutely. And a good time to mention as we do wrap up that if anything from today's episode, or if you have any question in general, again, our email is comments@physicianshelpingattorneys.com. And make sure that if you're watching us on YouTube, you can listen to us in the car on our podcast, where iTunes, Google Play, anywhere you listen to your podcast. If you're on the podcast and want to see what we look like, warning, it's not all that exciting. Our looks are not all that staggering, but we do like to connect via video. You can hop on YouTube, our channel. You can just search Physicians Helping Attorneys on YouTube and you'll find us. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you're on the podcast, you can follow us on your podcast to get updated for the most recent episodes. And on YouTube, click that subscribe bell and you'll get notified when we have new episodes. We try to do these about every other week, right, Armin?
Right.
So,
and I think the final thing I'd say, Mike, is if you're an attorney and if you have a case and you have a question about a case, or you just think it might be helpful to run the case by a physician, get a hold of us at comments@physicianshelpingattorneys.com. So we appreciate you being on the podcast, listening to the podcast, and so many of you that are following us. And we look forward to having you on the next episode.
We would like to thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
And we really want to help you to increase case value, save attorney time, and do it without breaking the bank.
We're really looking forward to 2024. And so go ahead and click that subscribe button. Hit the notification bell so you're notified of any new episodes.
And we look forward to having you on the next episode.